America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on Central America and the country of Panama, an economic and political partner of the United States. Our guest, Isabel de San Malo de Alvarado, served both as Panama's Vice President and Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2014 to 2019. Vice President San Malo was the first woman to be elected Vice President of Panama. Prior to the vice presidency, Vice President San Malo served as alternate permanent representative of Panama to the United Nations and worked with the United Nations Development Program, where her team facilitated a national dialogue to approve the legislative framework for the Panama Canal Authority. In 2015, the Harry S. Truman Institute for the Promotion of Peace honored Vice President San Malo for her career achievements and her government's facilitation of the 2015 meeting between President Barack Obama and President Raul Castro in Panama City. The Isthmus of Panama divides the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and bridges the Americas. Native peoples have lived in and migrated through Panama since prehistoric times. Spanish explorers occupied that strategic strip of land in the 16th century and used it to launch conquests across Central and South America. After 3 centuries of Spanish rule, Panama gained independence through a bloodless revolt on November 28, 1821, and joined Simón Bolívar's Gran Colombia. After Gran Colombia broke apart into the states of Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela in 1831, Panama remained part of Colombia until November 3, 1903, when it gained full independence as the Republic of Panama. The United States officially recognized the new nation 3 days later. Early Panama-U.S. relations centered on the formation of the Panama Canal Zone and the development of the canal. 2 weeks after Panamanian independence, Felipe Banuvarira, on behalf of Panama, and Secretary of State John Hay negotiated a treaty granting the United States exclusive rights to construct, operate, and maintain a canal in exchange for protection of the new republic and financial compensation. Both governments ratified the Hay-Banuvarira Treaty in 1904, even though the Panamanian government never formally granted Banuvarira consent to negotiate. The canal was completed in 1914, but Panamanians doubted the validity of the treaty. Multiple Panamanian and U.S. administrations attempted agreements to address Panamanian concerns over the canal zone, but the U.S. Congress consistently opposed the agreements. Unrest over the canal zone in Panama erupted into riots in 1959 and 1964. Continued unrest prompted President Jimmy Carter to prioritize renegotiation of the treaty upon his inauguration in January of 1977. 15 months later, the United States and Panama ratified the Carter-Torrijos Treaties, which established the canal as sovereign Panamanian territory and extended the right of the United States to continue operating the canal until Panama gained control of the canal on December 31, 1999. 20th century U.S.-Panama relations were often troubled due to coups or disputes over the canal. In 1983, Panamanian General Manuel Noriega consolidated political and military power to become the de facto ruler of Panama. Noriega became estranged from the United States due mainly to his ties to drug cartels and narcotics trafficking. Following Noriega's refusal to cede power after the 1989 Panamanian election, President George H.W. Bush launched Operation Just Cause in December 1989 to restore democratic rule to Panama. U.S. forces captured Noriega and brought him to stand trial on narcotics charges in the United States. Today, the U.S. and Panama are essential economic and security partners. Panama attracts the largest amount of foreign direct investment in Central America, and the United States remains the top user of the canal. In 2016, Panama's expansion of the canal to double capacity boosted Panamanian and U.S. trade and benefited the economies of both nations. In 2019, the two countries signed a letter of intent to increase security cooperation, combat transnational crime, expand trade, and collaborate on a regional approach to migration management. We welcome Vice President Malo as Panama and the United States pursue increased cooperation on economic development, migration, trade, and law enforcement.
Vice President St. Malo, Isabel, welcome to Battlegrounds. Let me begin by saying what a pleasure it was to work with you years ago. I always appreciated your candor and your great sense of humor. It's great to see you.
General, thank you so much for inviting me to Battleground, and it's a pleasure looking over together with you the region and the world. It's an amazing invitation, so thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, this is going to be great for our viewers and our listeners. You know, you've been working on so many important projects these days, and one of them is a project with the United Nations Development Project on governance in Latin America and the Caribbean in the face of COVID-19. You've been working on really how the region, the world, can emerge from this crisis stronger. And so I'll just begin. Can you tell us about that work and what has been the Latin American and Caribbean region's greatest challenge, do you think, in managing the pandemic? And then what do we have to do to work together to emerge from this pandemic stronger and to really regain, the ground that we've lost and overcome the suffering that so many people have experienced?
If we had 2 years ago looked forward to see what was happening in 2020 and 2021, I think nobody would have guessed the world was going to be in the midst of this pandemic, which has clearly been a health crisis. It has also been an economic crisis, and it has the world upside down. Fortunately, I think vaccination sheds hope and some light, and we're looking forward. But yes, with UNDP, the development organization of the United Nations, with development at its core, the pandemic came to be studied as not only the halt in growth and development, but the potential regression, which is very worrying. And looking particularly to the Latin American region, we have seen that the pandemic has exposed pre-existing conditions that were there, that we knew were there, but that are just very crude on our faces with the pandemic. As I've said, not only an economic crisis and a health crisis, but for Latin America, also an educational crisis. We still don't know for certain how many children will probably never go back to the school system. The lack of internet connectivity in the underdeveloped countries results in many children not having the same access to virtual learning that you find in the developed world. And that's a reality, a crude reality in Latin America. So for us, after a 6-month evaluation with the participation of leaders from around the region, we've concluded that the pandemic for Latin America, it's a governance crisis, because it's an issue of our institutions and our inability to respond to a crisis the way other regions have responded. And now we need to learn from that in order for our ability to build back better. So a governance crisis, if you see the numbers, Latin America has, at the end of 2020, about 9% of the population of the world. However, we had 20% of COVID cases, double our size, and we had 30% of the deaths. So those numbers right there show how this region has been hit harder by a pandemic. And Latin America is not the poorest region in the world, but maybe is the most unequal. And that is a reality there of our institutions not being able to respond for everybody in the same way. Once again, several millions of students are able to continue their schoolings where millions of students are not. So looking forward, our approach is the necessity to build back better. And this, I know we've been mentioning this around the world in several fronts, but in terms of Latin America, it's a call to action for us to know that we need a new social contract. We need our elites to understand that unless we prioritize institution building and the fight against corruption and the fight against inequality and poverty, we're going to have problems. You know, this is a middle income region, but we don't really have middle income societies. We have within this middle income region exclusion and pockets. So I think the pandemic gives us an opportunity to pause, look at what we have, and understand that we need to get our act together and understand that those challenges of development are really at the core of all of our problems, of our security problems, of our migration problems, and of course, our lack of services problem.
You know, Isabel, I've seen in the elections, right? There are 4 big elections happening right now in South America, and those elections have been about these issues, right? About about economic growth, development, but also equality of opportunity. You know, big disparities, right? In income, big income gaps, and so forth. And then even in the midst of the pandemic, I remember the demonstrations that we saw in Colombia and also in Chile. You know, and so I just wondered, you know, the people. It seems like the people are demanding a change, that they're frustrated. Where's that frustration coming from? Is it coming from COVID and COVID exposing, you know, some of these issues as kind of almost as a pandemic auditor of societies, and what do you see the trajectory, especially between different philosophies about how to cope with it? So, for example, in Peru, where you're going to have a runoff election very soon, you have wildly different ideas, right, about how to cope with inequality of opportunity and the big gap in income. You have still those who are advocating for, you know, the free market as the best way to do that, and others who are taking a more statist approach, maybe even a more socialist or approach to the economy. And that played out in the Mexican election recently. You saw it play out in Argentina. So is there a competition of ideas associated with how to emerge from this crisis? And what's your assessment of that competition? And where do you stand? What do you think is the right model?
The competition is certainly there. We can argue, I am not sure if it has exacerbated as a result of the pandemic, but it was certainly there before. We were all shocked at the end of 2019 when a country like Chile, which was one of the
success stories, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Examples in the region in terms of growth, development, services, stronger middle class. And what you saw in Chile was outrage. So Chile, Bolivia, there are several examples showing
Ecuador. I mean, it's really throughout the region.
Yes,
absolutely.
It is throughout the region. But where do I stand? Panama is a free market economy. I'm a believer of free market. Our country has done well. You can even say that Panama is a success story when you look at our numbers, and we are the one country in South America that attracts the most foreign direct investment. And we have a strong financial sector, and we have a strong logistics sector, and we have the canal. So I am certainly in favor of free market. However, I believe that the discussion for Latin America, it's not that. Because regardless of the different models that we have within the region, and I certainly have my own views as to which model is best. The reality is that we all face the same issues, regardless of if the model is free market or a more socialist model. We have exclusion, we have poverty, we have inequality. That's the real fight for this region. And I believe that if our leadership does not understand that we need to come together regarding that common enemy and understand that it is legitimate to have differences. Who said that we all need to think alike? It's legitimate, but it's not legitimate to not pay attention to the numbers of exclusion that we have within our region. So I believe that this polarization that we find in Latin America, that it's also found in a way in the United States and in other regions of the world, it's really not conducive to anything positive. I think we need to concentrate on development and what can we do, what can our partners do. When you look, and I believe it is this year that the Alliance for Progress will turn 60 years. You are a professor of history and you are a great student of history and you look at what history teaches us constantly. I think it would be great to look at history and what have the different models of accompanying efforts for development shown.
Yeah.
What's the difference, for example, between the Alliance for Progress and the programs that were once installed for Korea and Taiwan that really transformed those societies? There's got to be a difference there. That's what we need. We need to transform our societies so that we give opportunities to those that today are not getting those opportunities. So yes, polarization is here. Yes, I am concerned about it. But I'm more concerned as well of the doubts that Latin American societies have of democracy being the right model for us. That really worries me. Many years ago, we were all facing guerrilla warfare and authoritarian regimes and military regimes, and then we were all striving to have democracy. Now, not all of the countries in the region. There are some worrying exceptions, but democracy is present.
I mean, think of the difference, right, between the 1980s, right, and the 2000s. It's astounding, the progress in connection with democratic governance. But you're right. There's this new sort of reemergence of authoritarianism and statist models, and so how do you see the trend? This is a really, I think, important theme that cuts across the region.
I don't think that we know the result yet. Certainly the forces have been for the past decade there, and you see pendulums, which is part of history as well. The recent election in Ecuador was important in that regard. The next elections in Peru are going to be very important as well. So I don't know what the future will determine in terms of left and right, but I do know that in terms of polls done by Latino Barometro, most Latin Americans no longer think that democracy is solving their problems. So they no longer think it matters the type of system that you have. That is something to look at. When people stop believing that democracy is what we should strive for, that's a problem. And that happens in countries that are swinging right and in countries that are swinging left, because it doesn't have anything to do with ideology. It has to do with the fact that people don't feel that democracy is solving their urgent needs, that it's providing more opportunities for them and for their children, that it's providing better services for them and for their children. So I think that's something that our partners, like the United States, that partnership is important, and I think it's something we should concentrate on and bring back the notion that democracy has its flaws, but it's the best system we've
Right.
identified so far.
Right.
So let's bring that back, that notion back, and let's try to make it better. We do need to have it improve the livelihoods of our people, which is not happening.
And I think also maybe just redefine the discussion, right? I mean, democracy is having a say in how you're governed. I think what people are frustrated about is they feel like they don't have a say. They feel disenfranchised. So it's a reform of democracy and representative government. It's not a rejection of it. And so, Isabel, I wonder if you might talk about the authoritarian regimes in the region, right? And what your prediction is about their trajectories in the countries that are really most problematic. I mean, closest to you, I guess, are obviously Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba, and of course, for those who doubt that democracy is the right model, of course, these totalitarian, authoritarian regimes certainly are not the model because of the tremendous suffering that people are undergoing there, the lack of due process of law, and the way people are persecuted in those countries. How do you see this kind of competition between democracy and this extreme forms of authoritarianism that exist in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua?
It's interesting, and the three situations are completely different, and came to life with a very different story each, with a very different history each, and I think they need to be looked at separately because they're not all the same.
Right. And it's a period of where there's change happening all the time, right? Because you have there's now a leader in Cuba whose last name is not Castro, but the army is still in charge, and in Venezuela you just keep thinking, can it get any worse? I mean, it's so bad. So I'd love to hear, obviously, your diagnosis, but also what you think is going to happen in the coming years.
Let me refer first to Nicaragua, because I think it's very sad that the world is not really paying enough attention to what's happening in Nicaragua. Venezuela is on everybody's top of mind. Has been for the past years. Nicaragua is not. And we have elections taking place in a few months in Nicaragua. Will we have the same scenario that we've had for recent elections, where they are mock elections and the will of the people is not respected? That can happen. What is the Western Hemisphere, our neighbors, the world, going to do regarding that? There are several multilateral organizations that are out of Nicaragua, have been out of Nicaragua for a number of years just because they have been expelled. I'm not sure, but I even believe that Human Rights Watch has been, as an NGO that monitors human rights, it's not allowing. So it's like there is a world going on in there that we have very little information on. And my biggest concern with Nicaragua is that we're not paying enough attention to what's going on there, and we need to look at what's going on there. I believe that the population is showing stronger signs of not willing to take it anymore, and that's positive. Will that be able to result in a unified opposition that can ensure that democratic processes are in place? We need to wait and see. But that's the case in Nicaragua, and we need to recognize that what's happening in Nicaragua was fed for many years by a complacent population, including the private sector, that things were going well. Okay, it's an authoritarian regime, but we can do business. That's a problem. Venezuela, it's a whole different situation. Venezuela, the humanitarian crisis, it's undescribable. The suffering of the people of Venezuela is undescribable. People do not have medicines. People do not have food. People do not have work. And I believe that Maduro knows he needs to go. What I wonder is if the world has really carefully looked at an exit strategy for Maduro. Because where is he going to go? Not only him, but this whole regime, they are protected by the same system that they've put in place. They have nothing left except holding on to this situation, holding on to this system, which is not working in every way, but they're humans. So what are they going to turn to? So I believe that we need to concentrate in Venezuela in finding an exit strategy. And I will not go about what that needs to look like. I think that is important what the Venezuelan opposition has to say in terms of that. And they need to come closer as well. The Venezuelan opposition needs to work together. President Guaido has made some progress in that regard, but still a long way to do. And also, I believe that the Western Hemisphere need to understand that there are other players, important players from other regions of the world that have a role to play in the potential solution to Venezuela, basically Russia and China.
Right.
And
his biggest sponsors, right, are Russia, China, Cuba, and also Iran, right, who's keeping him on life support to a certain extent. So that's not a cocktail party, Isabel, I would want to go to with that group right there.
but I fully agree with you. But there are two ways of facing complex issues like this: force or conversation. We know the costs of force. We know and we don't, because force, we know where it starts, and we don't know where it ends. Are there conversations happening in terms of a potential exit strategy? I don't know. I think there is something lacking there. And in terms of Cuba, I think it's positive, the changes that you've mentioned. Are they enough? Will they be fast enough? I thought that the steps taken, for example, by the United States when the position was shifted in terms of engaging with Cuba in the Summit of the Americas in Panama while I was in government, I thought that was positive. We'll see what happens from there. But I think definitely Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela are three very, very different situations that need to be looked at separately.
Right.
But
I want to just thank you and for everything you did on the Venezuela issue at the time. And we were great partners with Panama, I think, and we worked very hard through the OAS to try to get the Organization of American States to play a more productive role. It was difficult, right, because many of those states were bought off with Venezuelan oil. But I think that the dilemma oftentimes is that if you want to, for example, the Obama administration approach to Cuba, the opening, actually all of that economic activity just strengthened the army, because the army is the beneficial owner of all of the companies in the country. So it's almost as if there has to be a transformation from within. And it seems like there's growing popular discontent in Cuba, certainly. It's a horrible situation in Venezuela and Nicaragua. So I'm hoping that maybe just pointing out what life looks like in these countries can actually be a part of the debate that's convincing between a free market economic system and a socialist system, or certainly between democracy and authoritarianism. And Isabel, the other really plague across the region, besides these authoritarian governments that stifle human freedom, is transnational crime. Sometimes they're connected, right? A lot of the times there's organized crime. I think is one of the ways that Maduro, for example, stays in power. With the black economy, that limits the effect that sanctions can have, for example. But Americans, oftentimes, they only see the results of some of the effects of transnational organized crime, and in connection with either the narcotics trade or the migration crisis. And you're right there, right? You're right neighbor to these organized crime networks that are ravaging Central American countries such as El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and of course. A lot of that trafficking and movement of people in narcotics, goes through and around Panama. I would love to hear your perspective on this problem and what's happening now. Certainly, it's not enough, but what more can be done to address, to combat this problem of transnational organized crime and narcotics trafficking?
Transnational crime, narcotics trafficking, it's a huge problem around the world. It's a huge problem for our hemisphere, definitely. And we have countries in different positions. Panama is it's not a drug producing country, but Panama is a transit country. We have neighboring countries that are drug producing. So the issue and how to face it, it's different for every country. My belief is that it's a very complex problem that cannot be looked at just from the security standpoint, because it's larger than that. Number one, drug trafficking exists because there's a market. That's a problem. Number two, drug trafficking is a crime, but when you look at drug producing, you have the criminal organizations that are behind it, but you have innocent rural people that are making their livelihood out of that. What is the alternative for those people that are just making a livelihood and are not involved or concerned about the crime? They're part of a chain, for sure, but it's a different situation. The rural campesino in the mountains that is supporting his family as a result of this crop that he's able to sell easier than if he were planting other types of crops. So that's a different situation. And going back to what I said earlier of the development issues of Latin America, we need opportunities for people. Crime thrives when there is exclusion and when there are lack of opportunities. I am not blaming just lack of opportunities for it, because there are many people without opportunities that would not make that their choice, that are good people that would not look into crime. But it's certainly attractive, particularly for the youth. So it's a problem that I believe needs to be looked at holistically. And I go back to what I've mentioned in terms of development. What are the programs to create opportunities, to allow people to sustain their livelihoods, to support their families? And then, of course, foreign interference from other regions of the world. That is very worrying. And we hear many things about illegal mining in Venezuela and which groups support this and which groups control vast territories within Venezuela.
The whole tri-border area, right, which is almost an epicenter of illicit flows of all kinds of goods and financial flows.
That's something that needs to be looked at, for sure. And also in terms of the drug trafficking, something that has been growing that we need to pay a lot of attention to is the maritime sector utilized to service the European market. Yeah. As much as the United States has for many, many years been very strong on oversight to prevent, and it's still not a total success, but the United States.
And a lot of interdiction activity constantly.
There are other countries where that is not so much, where ports are not really, and there where not even ports for interdiction, but where businesses being financed by money being laundered from transnational crime or drug trafficking are thriving. And I think there are other regions of the world where we need to look at this closer. And then again, HR, these are problems, global problems that require collaboration for their solution.
Right.
And there again, the role of multilateral organizations and the role of diplomacy and the role of collaboration between governments. I think that's central.
And Isabel, Panama's central to this, I think, because of your own historical experience together, right? And I think what we've discussed so far is all interconnected. Governance is connected, obviously, to economic growth and development, and is connected to this problem of transnational organized crime. Oftentimes, the lubricant for transnational organized crime is corrupt governance, right? And in particular, leaders who provide impunity, right, for these groups to operate. And I'm thinking of the case, especially of the Panama Papers recently, which exposed how intricate and pervasive these criminal networks are. This was the 2016 release of all these terabytes worth of files related to tax havens. And have we learned from that? I think the release of those papers, and what more do you think the United States, Panama, other nations can do to not only interrupt these illicit flows internationally, but also kind of lift the cover for them and to really effectively go after these corrupt networks that enjoy impunity in a lot of places across the world?
The Panama Papers definitely shed light globally on a scheme that was going on around the world to launder money and evade taxes. I need to say, however, this scheme, the papers show that it's very elaborate, and the crime is not in opening up shell companies, and the crime is not in opening up a bank account, which was open around the world in countries not like Panama, and the shell companies were registered most of them not in my own country.
Yeah. Like Cayman Islands, all these havens, these tax havens, exactly.
But the problem is the connection of the shell company and the financial system with people illegally utilizing this system for illegal purposes. That's a problem. The Panama Papers shed light on an effort that was an effort already existing. My own country was already on the reform path. We had already asked OECD and expressed to OECD our intention to join the Exchange of Information Convention. We had already signed many treaties of exchange of information. We had already reformed some local legislation to strengthen the oversight over these types of businesses. The sad for us Panamanians part of Panama Papers is that it had our name on it, and definitely it was not about Panama. It was not about Panama. It mentioned a law firm based in Panama doing things that law firms do in the United States and in many other countries that were utilized with this scheme with banks not within our country. So that was harsh for Panama. Let's look at the positive side. On the positive side, I think it pushed an agenda within my country and within other countries that is necessary, that it's important, that we need to continue to work for. And also, again, this is about collaboration. And I think the efforts that the world is doing in terms of exchanging information and ensuring stronger oversight are positive. And these are the types of global efforts that need collaboration and where the multilateral system can continue to play a role.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of how interconnected these problems are, and how you really do need multilateral collaboration, right, across law enforcement and also to gain visibility of illicit financial flows. And what I love about our conversation and focusing on Panama is if you just try to imagine yourself in Panama and look at the world from Panama's perspective, Panama connects the world, right? I mean, it connects hemispheres. It connects the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. And when you look outward from Panama, you get, I think, a different perspective of the world, the economy, as we're talking about organized crime networks and so forth. And so one of the topics I'd like to talk with you about is how COVID has been an auditor. We've already talked about this, how COVID has been an auditor of our societies, of certainly our healthcare systems and governance and our economies. But it's also been an auditor of obviously international trade, for example. And it was this crisis that I think alerted us to the fact that we biased our supply chains, for example, Isabel, too much in favor of efficiency, right, and cost effectiveness, and not enough in favor of resilience. And of course, Panama is the great connector. We saw what happens when a very important canal gets blocked with the Suez Canal crisis, the traffic jam about a month ago. I would love to hear your perspective on global supply chains, and in particular, maybe this over-reliance on efficiency, and by connection and cost, over-reliance on China, and how do you see supply chains adjusting, and how I think that could be a big benefit for the hemisphere. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you see the trends what the trends are associated with global supply chains and the effect on our hemisphere.
I love your mentioning of Panama as a connector. We definitely see ourselves as a great connector. We've connected people and regions and countries even before we were born as a republic. You take the Portobello fairs, and you take the times of colonization, and when there was not a canal and people would come to the isthmus to transit by foot to go from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. So historically, actually, our birth as a republic is connected to that, in the beginning of the construction of the Panama Canal, where the United States has been our longtime partner in many ways. Today, we are a connector in other ways, not only the canal, but all of the maritime system connected to it, our ports, our airport. We have the most connected airport through the Hub of the Americas, flying directly to over 90 destinations. So I really like the word you've chosen, because that's very part of our core as Panamanians. Now, international trade and the integrity of global transport is central to sustainable development. We have seen, as a result of the pandemic, how global chains were interrupted, how people were made to look closer to closer providers, and that's positive in terms of climate change and global emissions, looking at adjusting global change so that we get our products from closer sources is positive. However, global trade is super important for the growth of the world, and we need to continue to improve global trade. It's interesting that even though Panama it's a very small country, when you look at the numbers, we are a very important trade partner to the United States as a result of this connection role. And the role of the expanded canal. I need to mention that as well. Before the canal was expanded 4 years ago, the United States had a harder time transiting liquefied natural gas from the Gulf of Mexico to Asian markets. Yeah. That is possible today at a smaller cost, with less emissions, carbon emissions because the expanded canal allows for those transshipments to happen. And I need to say that we're very proud as Panamanians that this expanded canal was done with our own resources. At a $6,000 million cost, if you take that to numbers of the beginning of last century, when the original canal was built, we just built a second canal with our own effort and our own resources. And that's something we're very proud of and that I believe plays a crucial role in terms of a global trade. The canal connects to 144 routes globally. What the canal allows for different regions of the world in terms of connectivity is amazing. And I believe that COVID has shed light on the importance of protecting routes, protecting supply chains for the benefit of humanity. And I also believe that we have an advantage in that regard because the canal, and I believe this is part of our inheritance from when the United States administered the canal for so many years, has always paid a lot of attention to safety and security. That's at the core of the canal administration, the safety and security of its own people, of transit. So they were able to respond quite rapidly, and it was not interrupted with this pandemic and in any way.
You know, Isabel, a new threat to our security, maybe our sovereignty that has emerged, has been how aggressive China's become. Aggressive, you know, in a military perspective, from a military perspective, on the Himalayan frontier in the South China Sea, and vis-a-vis Taiwan and the Senkakus in Japan, but also from an economic perspective. And when I look at China, I see various forms of what I would call economic aggression, right? And this is the debt traps that are set for countries. Ecuador suffered, I think, significantly from that kind of a debt trap that has indebted future generations of Ecuadorians. And then there are a whole range of unfair trade and economic practices that aim to really give China strategic advantage and then really dominance, I think, over global logistics chains, right? I think when you look at what's happened with fifth generation communications infrastructure, for example, and the subsidization of Huawei to be able to do that, that's because China wants to dominate that. But also when you look around the world, Chinese companies now run, I think, something like 140 really critical nodes, logistics nodes, including both ends of the Panama Canal. So what is your view of the threat to sovereignty from China? How can countries in this hemisphere in particular, but more broadly, ensure that they benefit, you know, from any kind of foreign investment, including Chinese foreign investment, but guard their sovereignty and don't give the Chinese Communist Party, you know, the keys to the future global economy in a way that would give them coercive power, right, over countries and allow them to pursue their interests and their model, right, the China model, which Xi Jinping and others are talking about very proudly now as a counter, right, to our free and open societies, our free market economic systems, and our democratic forms of governance.
You know, for Panama, the decision to establish diplomatic relations with China with the People's Republic of China during...
I remember our conversation about this in 2017, by the way.
1 week after I had been in Beijing signing the establishment of diplomatic relations. I will never forget. It was great news for Panama. It was celebrated in Panama. I need to say that it was a step that several governments in my own country had tried to take for years, and for a number of reasons, it had not been possible. It was celebrated for a number of reasons. I don't know if you're aware, but Panama has a quite large Chinese community for many years, very, very large. That's something that's interesting about our country in terms of being a melting pot. But also, China, it's a very relevant country in terms of trade, growth, the economy, a country as connected as Panama, and we've discussed this, how can we not have diplomatic relations with the second largest user of the Panama Canal? So in my own country, that was an aspiration for years, and it was celebrated. I believe that regarding Chinese investment and investment from other countries, every country needs to be aware of your own priorities. Every country needs to know clearly what is best for your country, for your people, what are your priorities regarding those objectives, and ensure that negotiations in terms of debt agreements and what sectors of the economy you promote these investments, it's an important decision to make. It's an important decision to make for every country. Every country should evaluate their own priorities and in that sense make wise decisions. And there are around the world situations where countries are heavily indebted, and that's a very risky situation. That is not the case of my own country with one particular government, but that is something that I believe we need to be aware of and we need to look at. The view within the United States, which I understand, that China's increasing presence in the region is of concern. And I understand it because the Western Hemisphere is the backyard of the United States. And the United States...
The neighborhood. We should neighborhood. It's in our neighborhood, we should say.
It's right, not the backyard. Thank you for that. It's a next door neighbor. It's the next door neighbor. That's a better word. But for Latin America to be in a position where we are made to choose, or where we are suggested to look at anything other than the well-being of our own people, it's not a good position to be in. We need, as sovereign countries, to be able to take care of our own people and identify what partnerships will help us in that regard. What could help? The United States it's a long-time partner, trusted partner to Panama, to many countries in the Western Hemisphere. I wish, and this is something that I discussed often with U.S. administration officials while I was in government, we celebrate more investment from United States companies. You mentioned the ports. These ports in Panama, Cristobal and Balboa, at both ends of the canal, were given in concession to Panama ports in 1997. That concession is over next year. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity. Where are U.S. companies that are going to be promoting their interest to participate in some kind of competition? We as a country need to look at how we improve the livelihoods of our own people, how we make our economy grow, how we make development grow. And in that effort, we need all of the partners that we can get.
Right. I couldn't agree with you more, Isabel. We have to be more competitive. But of course, China invests not just for a return on their investment, right? But they invest for strategic purposes. And I would just say that we have to maybe make the argument that, hey, it's not a choice, right, between Washington and Beijing. it's a choice really between sovereignty and servitude, I think, because I think what China expects, and of course we've seen it with these companies that have said, hey, we don't want to buy cotton that is produced by slave labor, and then how China, of course, went after them so aggressively. So, but I can't agree with you more. I would love to see Wall Street, for example, invest less in China, because in many ways we are underwriting our own demise by these investments in China, and invest more in Panama, for example, and in the canal. So I think you're making a really important point that we have to view this, obviously as as an economic competition, but China, because China views it as a strategic competition, we have to see it that way as well, I think.
And I believe Latin American countries need to see it from our perspective. What do we need to improve the livelihoods of our people? And in that regard, we need, again, different partnerships. And I think that bigger investments from the United States and other partners is very welcome.
Well, I would just like to, Isabel, as we come to the end here, I just like to ask you a general question, right? The Biden administration has just finished its first 100 days. And of course, what's dominated the news from a foreign policy perspective has been Iran and like the effort to resurrect what I believe is kind of a permanently dead Iran nuclear deal, unless could be a new one. And I think the chances of that are very low. It's been about Russia, right? And Russia's threatening of Ukraine and the mobilization of those forces. And of course, China has been foremost in the news from a foreign policy perspective. Not a lot about the Western Hemisphere, right? So I'd like to see more about the Western Hemisphere from the administration. What would your advice be to the Biden administration about how to craft a hemisphere foreign policy, Western Hemisphere foreign policy, and what should the president and the administration really take on as their top priorities?
I think it's positive that there have been messages throughout the campaign and after President Biden took office of the importance of the Western Hemisphere. He's even announced a plan for the Northern Triangle of Central America, which a group of leaders led by former President Chinchilla of Costa Rica, we have evaluated and given comments to, because we strongly believe that it's not conducive to a solution just to look at the Northern Triangle. We need a more integral and holistic view for the whole region. I believe that, and I'm glad you mentioned concentration on larger problems. Foreign policy tends to look at the bigger problems, and that leaves behind potential future larger problems. I wonder what would have happened in Venezuela if we had paid more attention years ago. Maybe that's where we are right now with Nicaragua. Yeah. We need not let these issues become larger without paying attention. So my recommendation would be to look at this next door neighbor, and I like the word you used, and how it is important for your own country, geopolitical reasons, for your next door neighbor to be well, and how can you strengthen the partnership with these next door neighbors to help them be better. And I think the pandemic has made the time right for that. It's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity that is there, and we could all benefit from looking at it and seeing that the issue is not security or migration or drug trafficking. It's a much larger issue, and unless we solve other governance situations, we're not going to solve those issues. And I go back to the example of the Alliance for Progress and the different, very differentiated plans from the Alliance for Progress that the United States deployed for Taiwan and Korea, for example. Different results came out of that effort. There are lessons there that history shows us, and Latin America needs to reform its institutions. We need to strengthen our institutions. We need to solve our governance problems if we want to solve sustainably everything else.
Well, that's just a great way, I think, for us to enter a conversation. I think it is important to have this positive vision, right? We're looking at all the problems all the time. And I think what you've left us with is the importance of us to work together to build a better future for generations to come, which is the purpose of this series. It is so good to see you again. You're such a wise person. And I can't thank you enough on behalf of the Hoover Institution for helping us learn more about Battlegrounds, important to building a future of peace and prosperity for our children and grandchildren. Isabel St. Malo, thank you so much. Great to see you.
HR, thank you so much, and for your interest in our region and all of your efforts to educate in terms of our region. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.